All right, so Yavilah McCoy, really, really happy to have you on the show. Nice to finally meet you in person. I was watching some Shiurim on YouTube. I had to get myself well acquainted, even though a couple of your family members I know pretty well. So,
Mhm.
I have to like come out of the gate and ask you the question. So, like me, you're black, you're Jewish, but unlike me, you were raised this way. You was raised in Brooklyn. You was raised Orthodox, Jewish home, the whole nine. Your parents are pioneers, even for people like me. And you went to Jewish school, day schools, whatever. And you also went to school in Israel. You also had to have the
Mhm.
opportunity to be there in New York and also in Israel. So how was it like growing up in that type of environment? I kind of have an idea seeing my own children, but I wanna know from your perspective how it was, especially as a person of color.
Yeah, it was training. I guess that's the best way I could say it. The way I look back on those days, it was training in what I was going to be and become. In the early days, I think what was most important was that I came from a home where my parents were very invested
Mhm,
in both my Judaism and in me growing up feeling strong and proud of myself.
mhm,
So, you know, in my early days, my father would go over the parsha with us. My mother was very invested in my homework. The very first pasuk that I ever learned in first grade, I still remember because my mother sat up with me the first evening when I was learning my very first Chumash pasuk in
wow,
Breshit, Hebrew to Hebrew. We had to translate it from Ivrit to Ivrit, and she sat with me until I knew it by heart. And here I
wow,
am, almost 50 years old. I still know it by heart.
wow,
Breshit בתחילה שהעולם ברא עשה מאין את השמיים השמיים ואת הארץ הארץ. Like those
wow,
words came into me because of the investment my parents had in our education, but also in our Judaism. And so
wow.
that was the beginning. That was the sun. That was the
Mhm.
sun that I came up in. Going into those schools, that's a whole nother thing. The biggest things I think that were super important to notice that I look back on now and try to teach people differently about is the total lack of expectation for my existence, that
Mm,
coming into those spaces and folks, teachers, principals having no expectation that a little brown girl could come in and be fully invested and ready and excited and enthusiastic about Judaism in the way that I was. Everything was a question and a curiosity. And
mhm.
that changed the trajectory of my Jewish education because of that lack of expectation. When I came into school and I knew the Parsha, people would go, wow. Or when my father speaks Hebrew fluently. And so when I would be able to speak Hebrew, people would be like, wow, where are you from?
Right,
All of that, which from their perspective, maybe it may have been innocent.
right,
It lands upon a young child's consciousness that you always have to prove yourself. You always
right,
have to come into the environment and make room for your existence, make room for you to be. And I think
right,
that was hard. I think
right,
that was hard.
right. So I would, if I can't, but talking to Rafi, also to Rafi, like definitely put me up on like him being in yeshiva, your younger brother, um, and having that type of experience. Now I'm looking at my own children, right, going through, and they don't even have half the knowledge of. I'm sure what your parents were able to give you because growing up in America, and I think back in the '70s or so, your parents had made their way to Yiddishkeit. Like very interesting how that was a time to where they really had to give you guys that awareness, um much more so. Like my kids are really growing up in Israel. They're so far away from America, they have no idea about American identity and what that is. So we're like, it was like, I want to say maybe my son was maybe 6 or almost 7 years old, my oldest boy, when I realized that he didn't even know what basketball was. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Mm-hmm.
you know what I mean? So
Mm-hmm.
can you
Mm-hmm.
imagine like cultural difference? And it wasn't like an on purpose thing, but just like it just wasn't a part of his. It was part of my life growing up, but just not a part of his life.
Yeah.
So my question is like, as you've grown, and I'm sure you have children now also, um, how does that translate over to them now, knowing what you knew before and then giving it over to your next generation? How much do you touch on social issues and feel the importance and need to give that over?
Well, I think. as parents, we're born in the generation that we're supposed to live.
Right.
And in terms of our children, they are living in the generation in which they're supposed to live. I mean,
That's right.
there's a concept in Torah called Yeridos Hadoros,
Right.
which means that, every generation
It's a
comes further
decline.
away from the light, right?
Right. It's a
And
decline.
but I don't think that's necessarily has to be true in the context of your your righteousness. Like
Mm-hmm.
you Noah was righteous for his time
Right.
and is mentioned alongside the patriarchs.
Right.
Why? Because in his time, just his way of being, even though it wouldn't have measured up possibly to an Abraham, it still was essential
Right.
that he did what he did in his time because it saved the whole world.
Right.
So there's for me, when I think about what I came through, early 70s, yes, because
Mm-hmm.
that's when I was born, like
Mm-hmm.
early 70s coming through. There are some things that are still the same that I
Mm-hmm.
can pull wisdom from in
Right.
terms of what I lived through. And there's some things that are completely new for this
Right.
generation. They're
Mm.
living at different times. So the thing that I think is most important for my children to know for me, like
Mm-hmm.
about my upbringing, is that I grew up in a context of love.
Right.
I was very blessed to have grown up under two African American parents who loved themselves. Like they were not confused about their blackness being anything that meant they were less than or
Right.
anything that meant that they had to apologize. In fact, they were celebrating who we
Right.
were and our
Right.
brownness. And I had a father who told me that essentially Abraham and Sarah looked like me. They
Yeah.
probably looked more like me than they looked like a bunch of Europeans in fur
Uh-huh.
and long locks along the side because they would have essentially died of dehydration living in the Middle East. Like,
Right.
who can do that?
Right.
Right. And
Right.
so you and your ancestors are essential and organic to this
Right.
Judaism. You're not coming here apologizing or asking for people permission.
Right.
So that love that came into me really early on, that we are essential and that who we are is a further expression of what Judaism can be,
Mm-hmm.
was bred into me. And
That's
so
amazing.
I think the thing that's most important for folks who are raising young folks is to look into young people's eyes and tell them that they, number one, are exactly who Hashem created them to be.
Right.
Number two, that Hashem is celebrating every day that they get up and move in the world and are honest and authentic about that creation being a gift. And
Right.
then number three, when folks try to run lies at you that have nothing to do with what Judaism has taught historically or presently about the essence of what a
Right.
human being can be in this world, that's exactly what it is. It's a lie.
Right.
And midbar sheker tirchak,
Right.
right? Stay away from lies. Stay away from lies. That's
Right.
not
Stay
for
away
you.
from it. Right. Right.
So this is for you. That's not for you. When you
Uh-huh.
see somebody acting foolish, stay away from them people. And when
Mm-hmm.
you see people who can open up and welcome you and be a part of your Torah, welcome them with a full heart and open arms. But
Right.
I teach my kids to stay away from foolish people. I'm
Right.
honest. Like
Right.
I don't need it. I don't want it. Neither do my kids.
Right. No, I listen. You're all who you hang around. That's what my parents used to tell me. So that's interesting. And here's another thing, which I want to understand if I know this right. That not only did you have your parents, but initially there were a lot of people. I don't know if it was a movement or something like that, but you didn't grow up with only your parents being the only people of color. There was more families around at the time that you grew up, right? Maybe not as present
Yeah.
anymore. I know there was a lot, and there's not a lot of families around,
I
maybe
grew
as
up
much, but
I grew up going to a pretty much a shul in which the majority of the minyan were men of color and
wow,
families of color.
wow.
There, it was run by a man named David Katan who is now passed on.
Mm-hmm.
He died this year. May his memory be for a blessing.
Oh man,
But yeah, we came up in a space where there were multiple families. My house on Shabbat and Yom Tov was filled with
right,
other Jews of color. I was not isolated, and I was isolated in my school.
right,
In the yeshiva I went to, it was just me and my sister. But
right.
in the world that I inhabited, I did not see my experience to be othered. I saw my experience replicated across lots of different faces and lots of different ways of being, and a lot of joy and celebration. People
So
enjoyed coming to my mother's house. My mother was a prolific cook. her challah and like her soup. And, she brought every ounce of Southern culinary deliciousness into a kosher kitchen,
I'm
literally.
like super jealous. I mean, what
Ooh,
your mother's neshama should have an aliyah. I
halal
unfortunately heard about
shalom.
last year. Last year, I think it was
Yeah.
already. So I didn't get the opportunity to have any of this, that you're telling me
Wow.
about. But I
Well, you
really,
can come
really
to my
appreciate it.
house. I didn't forget
Okay,
anything.
you didn't forget nothing. All right, we have
I
to
didn't
stop through
forget anything.
when I get to Boston. So
You got it.
here's my but how important was that for you? Like, my kids are sort of growing up in a similar situation. That's why I had to make sure that your brother-in-law sister moved close to us, and Ezra
Hmm.
Chaim and Yoel and a lot of other people here. My brother and sister-in-law, my wife's sister is married to my best friend since kindergarten. They're also both, obviously Jews of color. My wife's from Louisiana originally. So
Hmm.
we do feel like it's important to for our kids to not feel alone. You know what I mean? And that's
Yeah.
one of the biggest things. Like, yeah, very similar to you. When they go to school, they are pretty much isolated. They may have a cousin there, they may have themselves, but ultimately, and I don't think that they're doing a horrible job here. I think whatever has happened, and I may have to give a lot of credit to you and your family and what your mother and your father did, also too, because I don't think it's the same as probably years back because some doors may have been broken down by you guys.
Hmm.
But I think that it's been something very, very important. Do you feel like that had an influence on you growing up, feeling like, you know what I mean? I'm not alone. I may be alone, I'm saying in Kitta Gimel, but I'm not alone. You know what I mean?
Right. Right. I think that it is important for us to collect and build community, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to tell you something very honest.
Mm-hmm.
When I was younger, my father wasn't very interested in um, me marrying someone who was a convert. And I think about that a lot
Mm-hmm.
lately. I did, in the
Mm-hmm.
end, marry
Mm-hmm.
somebody who was a ger, but
Mm-hmm.
he said that the Rambam taught that we cannot create a community of converts, and
Right.
the reason why we can't create a community of converts, a Jewish community of converts, is because we have to remain at the essence, at the center of
Mm.
what Judaism becomes, for the Am to remain the Am, and
Right.
for us to remain a part of the Am. So
Right.
there's some both and that
Mm-hmm.
in my own generation, now remember, this is a convert saying that he wants his children to marry
Right.
um, into folks who were essentially from birth. As a person who was born into this space, as a Black woman who is unapologetic about my Blackness, I found that it was harder for me to connect essentially with someone from the physicality of what whiteness has offered in the US.
Mm-hmm.
It was harder for me, coming from the strong, solid background that I came from, to be able to not have it be an inhibition and a barrier between me and someone I married, to be able to be in a cross racial, cross cultural partnership where there
Mm-hmm.
wasn't full understanding and appreciation of where I come from.
Got it.
Now, I in the end was willing, when it came time for Shidduchim, we dated. I
Mm-hmm.
dated across cross culturally, cross racially. But the man that eventually became my zivug was a person whose spirituality matched mine to such
Mm-hmm.
a depth that I think also was a part of us sharing a physicality and a history and a
Mm-hmm.
tradition that
Right.
allowed us to really understand what our trajectory forward could hold.
Right.
So there's a both and. Parents may have one approach to say, okay, we have to keep them all around other young Jews of color. We have to create a community of Jews of color. And I think it's that, plus being completely humble, that there's what color has taught us in our family line and tradition, and the context of racism still being alive and well. And then there's the spirituality of what our color has taught us, which is where I'm at now. I
Right.
want a spiritual community for my children where they are discerning about their Judaism and can be in the company of other people who don't allow race to be an
Right.
obstacle and a construct. There aren't that many white folks that I meet who have spent a whole lot of time deconstructing the impact of race upon
Mm.
Judaism.
Mm.
I
Wow.
don't meet a lot of white people who have done that to the depth and breadth to which I could have started a family with them,
Right.
even
Right.
though my father probably would have encouraged me in the direction. So
Wow. Wow. Interesting. So let's talk about Ayeka. right? You
Hmm.
started Ayeka in 2001, right?
Yeah.
So what inspired you? What motivated you to do this? Your professional career to serve the Jewish people and specifically Jews of color. Like, was it because of the upbringing, or was there a moment or something like that that happened that made you like, I got to do this?
It really was my mother. My
Hmm.
mother was a very loving person, and she would always like give love, especially to the young people who were coming through with us in
Right.
our home. She, to everyone, she was Auntie Dina, and that was to people who were by blood our cousins, and even folks who were not. And
Right.
to the young Jews of color that I came up with who needed a lot of chizuk and a lot of strength, she was there for them. And
Right.
also, when folks encountered challenges, usually for Jews of color, the challenge around identity comes up around adolescence.
Right.
And when people become teens and are trying to find their identity and are experiencing themselves as othered in so many different environments, it's a very specific moment for when um, folks can go off the derech and
Right.
can like, and I don't even really believe in that phrase. I'm just going to tell you personally, but
Okay. I
they
want to hear
can
about that.
react. They can react to the experiences that are surrounding them. When a young person does not feel integrated within their community, I don't think that's most succinctly the problem of that young person. It's also the problem
Mm,
of the community.
absolutely.
And when the
I
community then shames and blames that young person and makes
mm,
them feel like their ostracization is only their problem, we have a problem, right?
masking.
So, right? So that's where I feel. And
Right.
so my mother would like try to reach for Jews of color and hold on to them. But many of the young people that I grew up with did not stay in mainstream Judaism. They
Right.
left because it became too hard
Right.
to feel like you had no community among Black people who are non-Jews, and you also had no community among Jews.
Right.
And to really feel that sense of integration took a lot of work. And so my mother never let go of any of those young people. She was her own little kiruv machine, and she
Right.
would call them and she would check in and she would say, "How are you doing?" And she would always say to me, "Yavi, we've got to find those kids.
Mm,
There has to
mm,
be some space where those folks can find home." And
wow.
even though our home was as best she could, a place where people could come, after a while, if you're not doing the things other people are doing, you feel sometimes
You feel
embarrassed.
right.
You feel like you don't have a place. And, this is next gen JOC stuff. This is
Right.
not like, in the first generation, we believe everything is possible. But when you've come through it over multiple generations, you see what triage looks like in our community,
Right. Right.
and the triage is real. And so when I first did Ayeka, Where Are You? It was because my mother really wanted me to create some space online where folks who, were spread out now and, doing their own thing, they
Hmm.
could find their way back to us.
Right.
And that's what inspired me to do that work initially.
Right. I I agree with you so much. I mean, I remember hearing so many different stories, I guess, at least about, and you said something. You don't like the frame off the deck. I really want to get a better understanding of what it is. Okay, so now on the off the derech in terms of off of the way, and I do think it has a very negative connotation where the community, like you said, is not taking enough responsibility to say that did we give a space for these guys
Agreed.
to find their own path within Judaism. I see it as a creative.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of talented young people, of all different colors, but always ending up in these, you know, yeshivas of the rejects, which I think have really big
Mm-hmm.
neshamas, a lot of talent
Mm-hmm.
and amazing personalities. And I've seen some of
Mm-hmm.
these guys come out of that system and they are superstars, right? But
Yeah.
they didn't fit the derech, right? They didn't fit the path, right? Which is
Yes.
ultimately, I would say that a lot of what we see today, the system as we know it, I'm saying at least in the more from places, which is probably the best that we can do with what we know, right? I'm saying
Mm-hmm.
maybe.
Mm-hmm.
However, it wasn't designed for everybody, and
No.
years before, people worked a trade. Not everybody was sitting in Colel, and for sure, everybody's wife wasn't going out to go work for them. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not
Mm-hmm.
saying that there wasn't some Gadolim and great people, but not everybody's Rav Chaim Kanievsky. Not everybody, you know what I'm saying? Not everybody can pursue that path. So,
Mm-hmm.
what's your problem with the term. I would like to say, like, what bothers you about that term?
Well, mostly it's because, and again, I learned most of my Torah comes from home and
Mm-hmm.
a mixture of what I learned in the system as a yeshiva and
Mm-hmm.
seminary person and what I learned at home. And my father was a deep Talmud of Rambam. And
Mm-hmm.
Rambam taught that Torah is a golden mean, that it's the
Mm-hmm.
middle path. It
Right.
is not the best of, it's not either on one extreme or another. It's a middle
Mm-hmm.
path that a human being finds that allows them to bring the best of themselves to their
Right.
service of God. And I find that a lot of times when you're talking about folks that are on the margins, it's because the path itself has become too narrow. That
Mm.
we create paths that aren't wide enough for all of us to move through.
Right.
And, I think it was last month or so when we were talking about the Ari Miklat in relationship to the Parsha.
Mm-hmm.
It astounded me to find out, no, it was over the summer.
Mm-hmm.
And it astounded me that every single road in Yerushalayim, every
Mm-hmm.
single road in Eretz Yisrael had to be built wide
Mm-hmm.
enough so that if someone had to go down that road to find, right, a
The
city of
city of
refuge,
refuge. Right.
it was clear. It was
Right.
clearly marked. What does that mean about roads and paths, right?
Mm.
This is
Mm.
somebody who might be ostracized for murder, and we made space enough on every road for that person to travel and find
Wow.
refuge.
Wow.
How much more so in the
Mm.
context of who we are every single day, just trying to find our way through
Mm.
Torah and mitzvot? There has to be space for people. And I
Wow.
find that we do not take accountability for noticing when our roads have become too narrow for all
Mm.
of us to travel with us. And
Right.
that's why I don't believe in that term, because I've met too many, like you say,
Mm-hmm.
beautiful nishamot,
Mm-hmm.
beautiful human beings that with the right love, with the right smile, with the right twinkle in somebody's eye, with the right welcoming, they could be amazing. And they are amazing, but they could be amazing in community. And we don't do our work to make that possible. So I look for the human in almost
Right.
every interaction.
Right. It's amazing. So tell me this: you focus a lot on the say the word is intersectionality, right, within Jewish, with race and gender and so forth. So why do you believe that focusing on these things, like the identities and different things like that, why do you think they intersect? Why do you think the intersect is so crucial for opening up the dialogue like today?
Well, intersectionality, at least in Orthodox spaces, and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes not so Orthodox spaces too, has
Mm-hmm.
gotten a bad rep because it's a way in which folks, at least in regard to issues of like equality and justice, are
Mm-hmm.
calling people out.
Right.
So there's two ways to be able to justice. You can call people in, which
Mm-hmm.
essentially is like it's like tochacha. Essentially, you can
Right.
give somebody tochacha quietly in their ear,
Right.
or you can give somebody tochacha if necessary in a public space. But the intention behind it has to be correct in
Correct.
order for you to be right
Right.
in the right lane with this work. So the reason why I say intersectionality is so important is because if we don't understand that there are multiple things happening at once, often in one person's identity, that are creating the conditions in which they present in the world, we often only have half the story.
Right.
So my journey is about, the amount of melanin in my skin, possibly to some, but it's also about my gender,
Right.
right? And it's also about my class.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also about my entry point to Jewish identity in terms of elitism, right?
Right.
The elitism, that the hierarchies of value that we create across denominations, across Torah knowledge, right? So
Mm-hmm.
all of those different things intersect in one person's identity to create conditions in which they present to the world.
Right.
And so, if someone just says, "Oh, we're all Jews," that's all like, sing Ani Mami, we're all Jews. So if people want to do that, that's great.
Uh-huh.
And if I'm singing Ani Mami in a group of girls who are inching slowly to the right and don't want to link hands with me specifically because they think my black skin is going to rub off on them, which has
Mm-hmm.
happened to me in
It's happened to
yeshiva
my kids
settings.
also. It's happened to my
Okay.
kids also.
So when this happens, then it's we're all Jews is not enough. We
Right.
have to start breaking the dimensions, which is why my organization is called Dimensions. You have to start looking into the dimensions of what Jewish holds and still make the commitment that we are one community. So
Right.
intersectionality allows us to go a little deeper beneath the surface and look at all the ways in which we have the capacity to welcome each other or exclude each other on various dimensions of who we are.
Interesting. So I want to get to anti-Semitism, but before I get there, because you just said something that sparks me, and it's something that all Jews of color absolutely have to deal with. Um, is in more so in for sure the last year or two with everything that's been going on in America socially. I I view these things really as separate things, dealing with prejudices and racism in the community, in the Jewish community and outside the community. I've had completely different experiences. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Part of the reason is, I think, and I've gone on record for sure saying that I don't speak for every person of color. I grew up in Seattle. Seattle is
Mm-hmm.
everything. It does have a hood. It has all this other thing. One thing that it doesn't have a lot of is blatant racism. We don't deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
Back east and definitely down south, my wife has probably experienced more coming from Louisiana than what I have. But I don't know from that. I know of the
Mm-hmm.
systemic racism of what everybody else had to deal with in terms of like, you know, eh, which I've gone on record, obviously saying being number one in sports, performing arts. My school, we literally had the number one basketball team in the country. We were high ranked in football. We were, and brand new uniforms, brand new stadium, everything, brand new basketball court. Every year we had, we it was like amazing, but we were last in test scores and we didn't have books inside the school. So somewhere the budgeting, I don't know who was doing the budgeting, but they missed out. You understand? But in terms of like actually feeling like somebody made me feel different about my color, I didn't experience that. And I
Mm-hmm.
and to be honest, I haven't experienced it much in Judaism. I think a lot of it is because a lot of people know me. I'm very much so out there. I've been a public figure, but my kids have, or my wife has, and other people that I know
Mm-hmm.
have. Um, so my question is, do you look at these and try to address these from two different angles, or do you view it as it's all coming from the same place?
Well, I'm a professional in this
Yeah.
field now. So, in terms of my
Well,
work,
that's
my
why I'm
part,
asking you. I wouldn't.
I know, I know. So, from the perspective of my parnasa, right, and
Uh-huh.
my expertise,
Mhm.
I'm speaking about racism on two levels for sure.
Right.
One is just on the personal level, yes, how
Mhm.
interpersonally our assumptions and our ideas and our biases show up in terms
Mhm.
of how we treat each other. That's one thing.
Mhm. Right.
But then there's systems. And when we talk about systems, this is how, when groups come together and create opportunities for folks to join or be excluded from groups, then
Mhm.
racism has a different spin.
Got it.
In institutions, right? When you
Mhm.
have the ability to admit someone or not admit someone, when your institution has been set up to provide a service, that has a different spin. All of
Got
these
it.
things have to do with the way in which maybe I feel really great about myself, right?
Mhm.
And I've never had anybody try to make me feel less than.
Right.
And when I walk into an environment where people have power, more
Mhm.
power than I do,
Mhm.
I experience myself as less than because of discrimination in that regard. And it's
Got it.
super important for folks not to separate the two. Not to conflate the two
Mhm.
and act as if they're the same thing. My
Got it.
neighbors say, "Oh, you're so great." And if we're the only, people of color on my block in Boston, because the zoning laws create barriers to class and to
Mhm.
bank loans and to all sorts of different things, then racism is not just a matter of whether you like me. Racism is about how in systems people of color are being discriminated against.
Mhm.
So we as a Jewish community have issues and challenges to navigate around both of those things.
Mm.
Yes, I want my children to be liked.
Mm.
And yes, I want yeshivot to be thinking about what part of their policies, systems, practices, ways of being are exclusionary to people who are not Ashkenazi and white.
Got it.
And if they have not done any thinking about it, they are probably more open to, like, it's
Mm.
a, they're more what do they call the word, susceptible. They're
Right.
more susceptible to practicing racism as a norm, because the assumption, the meta assumption, is when they say we and when they say
Mm.
service, they're
Mhm.
talking about a very particular kind of Jewish person. And
Got it.
I've multiple times I've walked into spaces, my kids are now grown. My oldest daughter now is out of college. And
Mm-hmm.
but from the time that they had to enter into different institutional systems, people, I'll sit across from an administrator that says, "Oh, we have no race problem here." I go, "Really? Have you ever asked?" Well, no. So how do you know? That's my,
Right.
like, how do you actually know if you've never asked?
Right.
Have you ever talked to the people who walked in and walked right back out of the door? Do you have
Right.
data? Do you have research? Have you looked at your policies and asked the question, who is welcomed by these policies and who is left out? This is the work of racism too, Nissim.
Right.
I
Right.
think
Right.
that we spend too much time talking about whether we like each other. Quite frankly, I'm old enough where I don't care whether you like me or not. I don't. I have plenty of
Right.
friends. I have a really good, warm community. If you don't like me, we don't have to like everybody,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
And we don't want to practice sinas chinam with each other.
Right. Right.
And we don't want to be in a situation where even if you can't love me, you
Mm-hmm.
don't feel motivated that you should love me because that's what the Torah has asked of you.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're in your process and you're doing your work and you're not quite there yet, like I said, great, you keep doing your work. I'll catch you when you're ready. In the
Mm-hmm.
meantime, I'm loving on myself and I'm loving on my own family.
Right.
So there's a way in which we have to like balance like loving each other, not loving each other. That's going to be a human problem. We're
Right.
constantly going to be in that.
Right.
Systems and institutions, that's a whole different thing. If my kid can't get into a school simply because he looks like this, that's
Mm-hmm.
not a whether you like me problem. That's your
Right.
system has a problem.
Right.
If I can't walk into a grocery store and get what I need on a Shabbos afternoon because you're serving everybody else, and you assume I'm the person who doesn't need what I actually need, we've got a system organizational problem.
Right.
So we have to start paying attention to both sides of what impact is around racism. You don't want to run a store where it's discriminating against people. You don't want to run a school where it's discriminating against people. We don't want to run yeshiva where there's discrimination against people. So that's an institutional job we have to do to clean up what our entry point is to that work.
Wow.
And that's what I do as an expert.
Amazing. You make it lights go off. Lights go off.
Mm-hmm.
Are on. So the next question is the anti-Semitism question. Obviously, you're gonna have
Mm-hmm.
to deal with you have a perspective being a Jew of color that other people are not gonna have. Now, when it comes to anti-Semitism, which is like growing rapidly on college campuses, right? um how does it how do you deal with that also too from your perspective? Because just like you may get overlooked at the bakery, I remember one time I was giving service to somebody. I was working in property management years ago, and I was helping them. I had a keep on and everything, but everybody, a black guy with a keep on. I think back then I was wearing a knitted keep. This several years ago, so he thought I was a Muslim, which is very interesting because most of the time I get into a taxi, even with a Palestinian dressed like a chassid, they still think I'm Muslim. But anyway, um, so I'm talking to this guy, and he's letting me know, and I'm hearing, and I'm dealing with people that are coming from lower income, or whatever, and he had a problem with some last landlord, and the guy that kicked him out had a lawyer involved, and the lawyer was Jewish, and then he starts bad mouthing Jews right in front of me,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, brother, I said, picked up my yarmulke, like, hold on, and then we had to have a kumbaya and had to talk, but it's one of those things where you may also get overlooked in other circles because, I had a person come up to me who said that he's heard things. He looks Ashkenazi, but his father's black, and no people will know. I don't know if he's like half albino or whatever. So he's gonna hear things when he's around people, and nobody would ever suspect because they didn't know that about him. When you're around other
Mm-hmm.
people of color, and you blend in other circles, and people start speaking bad about Jews, and you have to also, like, I want to know how you deal with that and how you combat that.
Yeah, I think anti-Semitism is literally of the denigration, right, of the Jewish people, our practices, our cultures, our customs, and it's also systemic. Just like I was talking to you about
Right.
racism having its
Right.
place in systems, anti-Semitism has had its place in systems too. I mean, there
Right.
was a time in Russia where there were 600 different laws on the books discriminating against Jews.
Right.
Easy, right?
Right.
Just like we have multiple laws that are still on the books in the United States that uphold racism.
Mm-hmm.
that are built upon segregation and assumptions of white supremacy. That's still on our books here in the United States too.
Mm-hmm.
So when I talk about anti-Semitism, and I encounter anti-Semitism with people of color who are, especially Black folks like me, who
Mm-hmm.
might get comfortable, as I guess that's
Right.
what you're doing,
Yeah.
right? Who might get comfortable and something might pop out of their mouth. I see it just as much as I see with white Jews as a moment of education if we're in relationship.
Right.
Meaning, if there's a relationship to be preserved here, then what I'm saying to them is not to like cast them away and dispose of them as an anti-Semite, is to make them aware of where they might be practicing anti-Semitic behavior, or where they might have assumptions that are based in something called anti-Semitism that they want to give up.
Right.
So has that happened to me? Absolutely. When I go down south, my family's from down south. I was in the park with my kids one time in North Carolina, and the woman sitting next to me on the bench we were talking and having a good conversation. And then she's like, "Oh, like why do your kids have those hats on?" And I said, "Oh," she said, "Like are you all
Mm-hmm.
Muslim?" And I
Right.
was like, "Nope, we're not Muslim, we're Jewish." And she's like, "Y'all are Jewish." And I could see her, it was just like going through her head, like, slow
Right.
grind, all the things she's ever heard about Jews, right? And so then she like sits there for a second, and then she's like, "Yeah, but doesn't that bother you that your children are gonna be going to hell?"
Right.
Just with a straight face. And I just like, I
Ah,
had to look at her, and I was just like, is that the first thing you want to say to me? I mean, we just met each other here on the bench and everything. Like when you first meet somebody,
right.
it's the first thing that pops out of your mouth to them. Yo, you going to hell, right? Like, does that even like, just like, I was just like talking to her. I was just like, you need to like hold that for a second. Like, and then she started laughing, right? Because she wasn't trying to hate on me. She
Right.
was trying to process through all the things she's heard in her. And it was a moment of cognitive dissonance. And out popped out of her mouth. But wait a minute, but what about that hell thing? Don't you know you going to hell? So
That is
after a
crazy.
minute, then because she could see I wasn't letting go of her, that we were still going to be able to have a conversation. Then we talked about it, and in
Right.
talking about it, she was just like, "Yeah, I guess that doesn't make sense." And okay, and like
Right.
and our kids are playing together.
Right.
Everything
Right.
is
Right. Right.
it's still cool. But
Right.
the problem here became misinformation that got laid in primarily, I would say, from a Christianity context
Right.
in Black communities about what Jews are. And
Right.
when I left that encounter, I wasn't just like, I wasn't just happy that I had a chance to stay in connection with another Black person and give her a lot of good information that she could now use. I
Mm-hmm.
also was concerned about how much misinformation people get from being separated
Right.
from Jews in communities in the
Mm-hmm.
US. We do not live together. We live
Right.
in the same communities and end up living separate lives.
Right.
And so that's where misinformation gets laid in.
Got
And
it.
just the same way that I'm doing that with a Black woman who
Mm.
has heard some things about, Jews having horns and
Right.
Jews going to hell and all this other stuff that makes no sense in my body that she's
Mm-hmm.
meeting, right?
Right.
The same thing is true of white Ashkenazim who make the same assumptions about people of color. And
Right.
I've had to like sit with them too and say, do you really want to sit here and have a conversation with me where you're using the term Schwarzer?
Right.
Is that is that something that makes sense to you given what pops up in your mind when you say
Right.
Schwarzer and all
Right.
of that negativity, and you sitting right over here looking at me,
Right.
and we're
Right.
supposed
Right.
to be having Kiddush and Shabbat?
Right.
Like,
Right. 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 Right.
how does all of that go together?
No, it's real. It's a real thing. It's a real thing.
So anti-Semitism is real, and
Right.
I fight anti-Semitism in systems. So
Right.
the way in which anti-Semitism shows up in elections, the way
Mm-hmm.
in which anti-Semitism shows up in communities where folks have been segregated as a result. There was like Baltimore. A lot of people don't know this. Baltimore's a big yeshiva town,
Mm-hmm.
but Baltimore Jews were told where they could live.
Right.
And as a result of being told
Wow.
where they can live, the entire derivation of Baltimore as a city came up under racism, but
Wow.
also anti Semitism, because
Wow.
Jews couldn't live on the white side of town. They had
Mm.
to live in the Jewish part, the Jewish ghetto that was created in Baltimore. So
Wow.
that's anti Semitism. The
Wow.
fact that there's a Jewish hospital in every town, almost every city you can go to in the US. Why is there a Jewish hospital? Because the medical system in our country wouldn't give white Jews who graduated from our university systems jobs, to the
Wow.
point where they had to create whole hospitals, right? To
Right.
resist anti-Semitism in our medical institutions.
Right.
That's baked into who we are in the
Right.
US.
Right.
That's anti-Semitism, if you ask me. And
Right.
there's folks who are holding anti-Semitic views because of what they've been taught in their families and the way we've lived with each other here in the US. And that's the kind of anti-Semitism that caused somebody to pick up a gun and drive miles away to a Pittsburgh synagogue and
Right.
shoot up people because they feel like Jews are the reason why, this country is going down.
Right.
Jews
Right.
are the reason why we have immigrants here.
Right.
All of that is anti-Semitism to me. That's the most dangerous form of anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism that I've encountered with Black people, for me, mostly has been a
Mhm.
point of education.
It's been an education piece. Okay, so I know I want to get you out of here soon, but I'm enjoying myself a little bit too much. So I have to ask you like one or two more questions. Um, I didn't know I was gonna enjoy so much. I'm like, I just sitting up here. I feel like I'm in class. Anyway, so growing up, there were obviously some people that influenced you apart from your parents. I'm assuming. I know I'm not saying maybe there wasn't, but like were there role
Mhm.
models of people that had a huge impact on you that had some type of hashpa, even maybe from the yeshiva system. Maybe there was a teacher who did show love, or maybe there was some, was there people that really had an impact on you that you could look back and say, like, this was a life-changing experience and it's helped me throughout my career.
Absolutely. When I was in seminary, I went to seminary in Harnov, and I got to be reunited with my pre-1A teacher, more Avivia
Mm,
Langzam.
mm,
And more Avivia Langzam taught us in pre-1A, but she had a very specific practice in circle
mhm,
where she would go around the circle and she would say rock Panina or
mm,
rock Hana. And what she was saying when we got around the circle is that at this point, only this child is going to get to speak and say whatever
mm,
they needed to say in relationship to the parsha. So rather than just call on kids, to start it off with that rock practice,
mhm,
right?
mm,
Only you.
mm,
It was loving on us and giving us a chance to shine, and
mm,
everybody knew they were going to get a chance, so it wasn't like a hierarchy thing.
mhm.
And so I just thrived for the time when she would say rock Yavilah, and I
Right.
would get to like hail forth about whatever my parents had been telling me or whatever. So
Right.
but the other thing was that I grew up in the 70s. So
Mhm.
rock also was resonating for me. I remember as a young kid with like rock steady, right? The kids around the block, we would have this rock steady thing where they would go rock, 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 rock steady. And then one person would get to do their thing, right? In a
Right,
group
right.
of girls.
Wow.
So the confluence of those things, of me being able to rock and also me being rock only,
Mhm.
Yavilah
Wow.
in Hebrew, was a beautiful thing that I experienced with Mora Avivia. And Mora Avivia also had so much love in her that she was the first person to teach me Hebrew. Like I learned Hebrew under her
Mhm.
tutelage. She made me, she didn't make me Queen Esther, even though I wanted to be Queen Esther in the play. I did get to be King Achashverosh though. And she made me feel really excited about being King Achashverosh now. I remember those words to that play too. So Mora Avivia Langzam showed me love when I was very young, and that was my first entry, the very first year coming
Wow.
into yeshiva, and it created a foundational space where the acceptance that I had at home could
Right.
also be experienced in the Jewish institutional space, and not all my siblings had a similar
Wow.
experience. That was
Wow.
crucial, I feel like, to my entry. The other teacher later on, going up into like eighth grade, kind
Mhm.
of like heading into high school, was Rabbi Label Newman.
Mhm.
And Rabbi Label Newman would come in once a week to teach the girls. He was the principal, the Hebrew principal, the mashpia. And
Mhm.
he would come in once a week right after davening. I still can hear the sounds of all the chairs. When,
Mhm.
when, when an elder walks in the room, you have to stand up no
Right.
matter what you're doing. So
Right.
we would be shuffling around, whatever, and all of a sudden that he hit that door and it was everybody
Right.
stands up. Yes. So we stood up for Rabbi Label Newman, and we had such a deep respect for him as an
Mhm.
educator.
Big
But
cover.
what happened is, as he taught us the chavod, what he would do is he would come close to the edge of your desk, and if he felt like what you were saying, he would lean down, he would look you in the eye, and he would go, "Excellent."
Mm.
And I still remember
Mm.
what it was like to have Label Newman come by in the middle of a Torah share, stand by the edge of my desk after I had said something, and lean over and go, excellent.
Wow.
Because what it did, I remember inside of me, it made me feel like I'm here, right?
Right.
Like this is my place. Like learning Torah is something that's, you know, like that where I get to be excellent.
Right.
And so those two, I think those two teachers were foundational and deeply made a deep impression on me, that even when I was in spaces where folks would, like, you know, not like my kids, where
Mm-hmm.
teacher wouldn't call on them, where
Mm-hmm.
they would, you know, be assumed that they didn't know the answer. There was all sorts of ways, like I said, this lack of expectation for
Mm-hmm.
excellence in yeshiva with young children of color becomes a problem and a challenge. The ones who didn't do that and the ones who showed me something different gave me hope that there could be something else.
That's
And so
amazing.
that's why I remain connected even to my Torah now, because of those people.
Amazing. So my last but not least question
Mm-hmm.
is, if you could go back and you could talk to a young Yavilah,
Mm,
what advice would you give your younger self?
mm.
I know it's a tough one. I've been asked it before and I also stopped for a second. But if
Well,
you could
you got
think
to think
about it.
about it. I'm
Yeah.
thinking about it. I mean, mostly what I would tell her is stop worrying so much about what other people think
Mm,
and spend more time just enjoying what you have.
mm,
I
mm,
think when we're younger, we always are looking toward the next day. Tomorrow is going to be better, or something else is going to happen, and it's going to change what you see right now. But there was a lot of beauty around me that I can
mm-hmm,
see now as an older person that
mm-hmm,
maybe I may have stepped over quickly when I
mm-hmm,
was young. Like if I could just hold on to how rich and unique the experience of being in a sukkah with my
mm-hmm.
parents and multiple, you know,
Right.
families and generations of Jews of color, and the singing, you know, like
Right.
there are so many different things, so
Wow.
many different things that left an imprint on my soul. If I
Wow.
could have just spent more time living in that and being in that and just noticing how special and unique it was, like if I could travel back in time, I would sit with Yavilah and just enjoy that.
Wow. Wow. Beautiful answer. Beautiful answer. Appreciate you being on the show. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm like excited to talk to you again. Hopefully next time it's in person in Boston over a few of your mother's recipes.
Maybe so.
So may it happen soon. But I really appreciate you coming on, and it was
Okay.
power, power, power. Really appreciate it to the max. Thank you. Thank you
All
so
right.
much.
Take care, Nissim. Bye
All
bye.
right. You too. Wow, wow, wow. Ladies and gentlemen, I am like stunned. That was an amazing conversation with Yavilah McCoy. And I learned a lot, but not only did I learn a lot, she actually affirmed some things. It was beautiful to have that conversation. I think still on the deal, I really haven't had, apart from I think, Mark Stoudemire, another Jew of color. But just the amount of knowledge that she was able to give and bring forth, and the fact that she's so seasoned. She was born Jewish. She grew up, and like, being a Jew of color, I heard about her family for many years. So it was just an amazing opportunity for me to hear her perspective. And I'm like really floored. I really didn't expect for the conversation to be just like wow like that. And it was. She's a powerhouse. I think that I have a lot to learn from her. I feel like the overall community can learn a lot from the things that she's saying. And, I'm just stunned by that conversation. So, as I always do, I love to leave you guys with a song. And I think my song for this week is my brand new song, Change. I think that it's a very, very appropriate song for not only the conversation, but just for the time. Ready to Change, a song about growth and going through hardships and really looking towards God and being able to say, like, I'm going to take this leap. There's a lot of people have to do, even of color, whatever background that they came in, coming into Judaism, of being like, I have to trust you. My heart is leading me in this direction, God, but I'm not used to trusting you. But now I'm going to give it over to you, and I'm ready to change. And I just don't want you to leave me. So that's the words of this song. And so until next time, dealers, only go from strength to strength and be strengthened. Peace out.
Running so blind, they nearly tripped all over you, yeah, yeah. I only stumble, I got humbled when you moved, yeah, yeah. so many hardships I was fighting to get through, yeah. Because you shine the light on me and let me choose, yeah. You